cognitive dissonance when you have two contradicted thoughts at the same time, and these two thoughts tear you apart, and you cannot make a right decision. And that's what creates cognitive dissonance, because you don't trust yourself to make a right choice between those two thoughts. And why it's happened? Because from one side, you're a part of the group, and they establish that this way of thinking is the correct one, and you have to comply if you want to be part of this group. From another side, something in you tells you that this thought is incorrect, and you question this way of thinking with your own thinking. And the problem is you cannot voice it. You cannot stand behind something that screams at you. You must stand behind. And that's what I thought about freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is not only prevent tyranny from happening in our country, it's also prevent you from becoming mentally ill. Because if you have freedom of speech and you are able to exercise this freedom of speech, it can actually help you to stay mentally healthy, because you can question yourself and you can think about your own thinking without afraid of being prosecuted and thrown in jail like under tyranny. But it's very important to exercise. That's why people now, for example, in America or Europe, they have this cognitive dissonance within them, and they have this mental almost illness where they have to scream something that obvious lie, but they think if they scream it out loud and behave incredibly aggressive, they would force people to believe into these lies, and somehow eventually these lies would turn into truth. And it's not. It will never turn into truth. Maybe a lot of people would accept it, but in the end they will know what is right and what is wrong. There's something internal within us helps us to understand that. But that's what I mean. I think freedom of speech is very, very important, not only to save ourselves from tyranny, but from becoming mentally ill and emotionally devastating. That's why you sometimes feel depression, because you cannot make a right choice, you cannot make a right decision. Another thing about us, we are biological creatures. And we have this persistent in us. We have our biology that has certain demands from us, and we have our mind that have certain demands from us as well. And we have this kind of strange existence. We're stuck between biology and our mind, and we have to make a right choice constantly, because our biology has a bunch of urges that pushes us away somewhere toward their satisfaction. And also we have a mind that want us to make right decisions. And how you can actually distinguish between your urges, your biological urges, and your mind. And I think biological urges in some sense responsible for creation of nihilism, these nihilistic ideas. If you think about nihilism is nothing matters. We will die anyway, and when you die, there's nothing after death. And why would you care? Why do you care about life? What would you care about other people? What would you care about their opinions? What do you have to do? You just have to satisfy your biology constantly. What do you have to do? You just keep following your urges and satisfy one urge upon another. At least have some pleasure out of life, since suffering is always inevitable and always right around the corner. And that's in some sense our biology demands from us. And it's always so hard to limit your biology. For some reason, biology doesn't have its own limitations. It always wants more than it actually needs. It wants more food, it wants more procreation, it wants more rest that turn into laziness. It always goes to the extreme and seems like it doesn't have enough common sense to stop on its own. And that's where mind comes, because mind, in some sense, is this observer that helps you to stop your biology on a certain point and not to evolve into something miserable, lazy, pathetic, and useless. But to do this, you have to keep your observer sharp. And for this, you have to understand your observer. You have to learn how to trust your observer. Because if you don't trust your observer, you trust more your biology. And it's easy to trust your biology because your biology gives you immediate pleasures. It's really easy to satisfy yourself with a piece of cake, with a bunch of sugar, with promiscuous sex, with laziness, with sleep as much as you want. Because that's what biology does. It's try to preserve energy, and it's try to survive doing as less as possible, while your observer, your mind, is constantly on alert because your observer sees something that your biology doesn't see. It seems like observer outside your biology, and this observer sees something, and it's really hard to understand what exactly your observer sees. But it's constantly limit your body. It constantly tells you, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do this, you have to get up early in the morning, you have to work out, you have to put yourself on a diet, you have to watch your sugar, you shouldn't drink, you shouldn't use drugs, you shouldn't smoke, you shouldn't behave in promiscuous way. It's constantly controlling your biology. And when you think about it, what exactly is the right thing to do? Who you should listen, your biology or your observer? Because both of them in some sense make sense. And both of them in some sense have pretty reasonable argument. But there's something about observer that make your life worth living, because I think the point of our life in our observer. Because if you want to really find meaning in your life, you have to use your observer for that. If you just want to have nihilistic way of living, just don't care and get as much as possible, then you follow your biology. I mean, you can use just drugs because drugs will make you happy, tremendously happy with that dopamine boost. But the problem is what would happen after. And after matters. Your life not only matters now, it matters after 10 years. And what kind of person you will be after 10 years, it's a good question. And that's what observer does. Observer has this idea, this consciousness that it can understand itself throughout of time. That's what I think happened to us on a certain level. First we were biology. We were just animals, and we didn't have a notion of time, and we didn't have notion of the future, we didn't have notion of death. We just live in the present. And what we did, we just stuff our bodies with enough protein, procreation, and just were taking the rest after a long hunt. But then something happened. We become more intelligent, and we become self-aware, and that's where observer emerges. That's where consciousness become a part of our reality. And with this consciousness, with the self-awareness, we suddenly realize there's time, and there's time, and there's future. And we're not only living right now, we're going to live in 10 years and 20 years. And we start building our lives slowly. We start understanding that if you have a lot of food, you don't have to eat all your food at once. You can be actually careful and eat a little bit today, a little bit tomorrow, a little bit the day after tomorrow, because it prevents you from starving. And you have to be very careful, you have to be smart. And I think our observer is the result of our evolution to become better, to survive longer, and to find meaning in our life. And why exactly we need meaning in our life? We can actually reverse and be just animals who live in the jungle like we used to. But we want to have meaning in our life because we become intelligent enough for that. And since we became intelligent enough for that, we start looking for meaning. But you cannot find meaning in your biology. That's where comes nihilism, because nihilism is just destruction of your mind, of your consciousness, of your self-awareness by becoming voluntarily slave of your body. I think the next step in evolution was our self-awareness of our consciousness, the idea of observer, where we can move past of our biology. And that's, I think, we should listen our observer. And how to listen to it, it's easy because in most cases observer is always right. I try to observe this on myself, but it's always good advice to limit yourself. Because when you go to extremes, it's never good. In a good sense or in a bad sense, extremes are never good. You have to balance on the edge in between. And that's my opinion. And how can you write a story without observer? Because if you're a biology, You cannot write a story by being just a biology. Your cat doesn't write a story. Your dog doesn't write a story. You need an observer to write a story of your life, because your observer can be outside of you and look at you from a third-person perspective. And only this way you can write your story, by treating yourself as a character of the story. Without observer, it's impossible to write a story. Without observer, it's impossible to find meaning of your life, because you need distance yourself from yourself. And once you can distance yourself from yourself, you're able to analyze your life and your life story. And therefore, the idea of proper sacrifice makes sense, because you cannot make a proper sacrifice if you're just biology. You can only make a proper sacrifice when you are an observer, because observer can perceive life throughout time, across years. And okay, I'm sacrificing this thing now because I know we'll get something else later on. For example, why you need to fall in love with one woman and have family with her only? Why not to mate with as many women as possible and have a bunch of kids out of wedlock? Because if you have one woman, one family and kids, you will become much more successful, and your kids become much more successful. I always thought it's better to make one woman happy than hundreds of women unhappy. That's the point. And actually you will make happy yourself as well with this stable, constant behavior where you keep writing your own story, when in some sense you even predictable, consistent in your behavior, because it's really hard to be consistent in your behavior. Biology always try to distract you, always try to push you to somewhere else. But you have your own story, and you can only write the story by using your observer, because biology trapped inside of this form, while observer is something outside. And that's where we got idea of God, because maybe God is the main observer of the universe itself, while we just tiny small observers of our human existences. Maybe that's what we need notion of God, because if you self-conscious and conscious enough to be able to observe yourself from a third-person perspective, why isn't logical to assume that there is some entity outside of our observation that is able to observe us, everyone, at the same time? Because it's kind of like a logical conclusion of our personal observer. And I think it makes sense, and that's, I think, where a meaning lies, because the meaning of life to follow your observer and to submit your biology to your observer, because your observer keep writing the story, and we have no idea what would happen when we die, and if our story truly ends or not. We only will be able to know this after our death. And I think the right way for us is to be able to speak what we think is true and stand behind that truth. And if we have to be able to sacrifice ourselves for this truth, because there's nothing matter but truth, because only through truth you write your own personal story that makes sense and filled with the real meaning of our life.